Away and welcome to the Transgender Rights series. I have spent the better part of a decade working in human rights in my kind of professional capacity, so it's been quite an interesting space and journey to kind of learn things along the way, and I thought that this would be like a really kind of cool opportunity to be able to share what my insights and my experiences have been like over the years in kind of just like broad human rights and how that pertains specifically to trans people in South Africa. So now a lot of what we're going to be talking about is kind of framed in a legal kind of way, but I'm going to try and not talk too much around, like kind of like legal jargon and stuff like that. So I'm going to try and keep the concepts like really tangible and try and make them kind of solid in a way that is accessible to everyone watching. Before we get in, if you've been enjoying content on this channel, please remember to hit that subscribe button. Also, you can turn the bell on for notifications to stay in the loop for upcoming videos in this series. Okay, let's get into it. So before we can talk about what the rights of transgender people are in South Africa specifically, we need to understand kind of what that legal framework looks like in terms of what the different sources of law are, which is to say, where does the law come from? In South Africa, we have 5 kind of major sources of law, and that includes things like legislation, the common law, judicial precedent, which is our kind of court decisions or our case law, international law, indigenous or customary law, and then there's kind of like, legal academic writings and stuff like that that kind of support the law. So those are our main sources of law. For the purposes of this episode, we are going to be focusing on the legislation bit of the law, because this is for us our kind of most solid, most weighty part of the law. So it's the bits of law that have the most force in the country. So to talk to the law that is the most weighty, the most supreme law in the country, we have to talk about our constitution. Now, South Africa's constitution has been hailed around the world as one of the most progressive, one of the most amazing constitutions because of its human rights framework, and it is quite broad and quite comprehensive and quite detailed in terms of the rights that it affords to its citizens, but then also the responsibilities that are placed on government that are also then placed on everyone in the country. So a pivotal thing in South African law is that the constitution is the supreme law in the territory, which effectively means that no law in South Africa can be in conflict with the constitution. So the constitution supersedes any kind of law. No other law that is made can be kind of going against the constitution or what they call being in conflict with. Okay, that is a very key thing to understand. Now, the constitution, the document itself, is divided into various chapters that deal with various aspects of the law. But for us, in our purposes, we're going to focus on chapter 2 of the constitution, which is the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights contains all the critical human rights that is afforded to every single person within the borders of South Africa, and those include things like the right to education, the right to healthcare, to shelter, to water and sanitation. And so all these kind of rights are encompassed in the Bill of Rights. And to dial even more focus in on these rights, what we're going to look at very briefly are the rights to freedom, equality, and dignity. So the right to freedom and security is afforded to every single person in this country, which means that you can't be necessarily detained for no kind of reason. You can't have any of your rights taken away for no kind of reason. There are special circumstances in this country where some of your rights may be kind of put on pause for a bit, but those are usually in very kind of extreme cases. In situations like when there's war, so if a state of emergency is declared, there are certain kinds of rights that can be put on pause. There are some rights that are like non-negotiable, that like you will always have things like, the right to life, etc. But for the kind of general purposes, right to the freedom and security of the person is that you have the freedom to be who you are and not to have your freedom kind of curtailed in any kind of way. This also pertains to making decisions about your body when it comes to reproductive health rights. And so this is where a lot of our sexual and reproductive health rights legislation and our abortion laws come from in this country, is the right to your bodily autonomy and also your ability to say no to certain medical procedures or to not be experimented on in any kind of way. So that is kind of freedom and security of the person in terms of your ability to make decisions about yourself for yourself. So to shift gears a little bit, the other right that we're talking about is the right to human dignity, and human dignity is one of those things that in our constitution is defined very, very broadly, so that it is kind of open for interpretation, because dignity is sometimes one of those intangible things, but it's such an important and crucial part of what makes us human beings. And so that may not be disrespected in any kind of way. So every person is afforded the right to dignity, and nobody can take that away, not any other person, not the state. And then finally for me, the one that has the kind of biggest energy and the biggest focus for me, although all these rights are kind of equal, but special emphasis here placed on the notion of equality. So everybody's entitled to be equal before the law. So everyone in this country is treated equally before the law. Everyone enjoys the full extent of all of their rights. And the thing that I think is one of the most important things that have been written into our constitution is the non-discrimination clause. And it reads as follows: the state may not unfairly discriminate directly or indirectly against anyone on one or more grounds, including race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscious belief, culture, language, and birth. Nor may any person unfairly discriminate directly or indirectly against anyone on one of the more grounds mentioned in the clause above. Which effectively means that the state or any person cannot discriminate against you or against a group of people based on who they are. The inclusion of this clause in the Constitution is such a critical part of our law. A lot of our legislation and kind of our policies around how we've constructed how we deal with people and how people access particular services are seen through this lens, through this notion that nobody may be discriminated on the basis of who they are, and then, you know, all those factors being taken into consideration. This is also largely due to the fact that we have a very particular type of history with groups being discriminated against and laws being passed to kind of actively disadvantage them in a particular type of way. And so that apartheid legacy that we have, this was one of those clauses that was included in the supreme law of the land, that those kind of things never happen again. But as we know, what is on paper doesn't always translate into reality on the ground. We're going to dial in a little bit of focus around what the law says specifically in relation to what rights transgender people have in South Africa. We spoke about the Constitution and how everybody in this country enjoys the same rights, specifically that everybody in this country enjoys the right to equality and not to be unfairly discriminated against on the basis of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, etc. And there's a whole long list. I will link some resources below for you so you can go ahead and check that out. But in a nutshell, South Africa only has one bit of legislation, as far as I know, that mentions transgender people. And that is the Alteration of Sex Descriptor and Sex Status Act 49 of 2003. And I know that's a mouthful. We'll go into that a little bit later. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about this. Now, some of you may have encountered the concept before, and for those of you who haven't, let's just give you a quick crash course. SOGIESC is an acronym that stands for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Expression, and Sex Characteristics. Now, sexual orientation is something that most people are familiar with, and that means who you are attracted to. So if you are gay, it means that you are a man who are attracted to other men. If you are a lesbian, you are a woman who are attracted to other women. Yeah, if that makes sense. So sexual orientation is who you are attracted to. It has everything to do with the other person. So the GIE in the acronym stands for Gender Identity and Expression. Effectively what that means is gender is your internal sense of who you are as a person. So where sexual orientation, the focus is placed on the other person, so it's who you are attracted to. Gender identity is who you are internally as a human being. It's an internal thing. Gender expression is how you manifest that identity. So somebody who has a masculine internal sense of who they are might have a very different gender expression to that identity. So somebody may be very masculine and on the inside but present as very feminine. Likewise, somebody who has a very feminine internal sense of self might manifest that outwardly as either feminine, or it might be manifesting as masculine. So for example, a woman can dress very masculine and can express themselves in the ways that we consider things to be masculine, which is also kind of weird in the same kind of way. And the same is true for men, who can express themselves masculinely or femininely, if that makes sense. I don't know if those are the right terminology words, but you get what I'm trying to say. Now, in the same kind of breath, there are gender identities that are not as binary, or not as kind of, let's call it extreme ends of the spectrum. So there are identities in the kind of middle, or that exist outside the space, and so these people may identify as being non-binary or gender fluid or gender queer. And so effectively just what that means is that somebody's not exclusively identifying as being masculine or feminine or man or woman. So that's gender identity and gender expression. Sex characteristics specifically refer to a human being's biology. So sex characteristics are those characteristics that we use as markers to effectively classify a member of a particular species as strictly being male or strictly being female. Now, there are a number of these characteristics, and they include things like gonads, hormones, external genitalia. So there are a whole number of them. And when a particular member of a species ticks all those boxes and neatly fits into those categories, we'll classify them as either being male or female. For the most part, the majority of people have never had all of their sex characteristics tested to kind of determine whether they neatly fall into the box of male or female. How that's usually determined is in the kind of situation, where a person is giving birth, the doctor, nurse, or midwife, or whoever's delivering that baby, will look between the baby's legs and go, oh, congratulations, it's a girl or it's a boy. So what that person is doing is having a look at one of these six characteristics, only one, and making a determination as to what the gender identity of that child is at that point in time, based on that evaluation on one of these six characteristics. And so a lot of the data and the research that is coming out is that for the most part, most people don't very, very neatly and strictly fall into the categories that strictly define something as being male or strictly define something as being female. And most people fall on a spectrum in between that. So people might have, different kind of hormone levels. Not all the hormone levels are the same for everybody. Not everybody's external genitalia look the same. So this notion about sex characteristics, why it's important to understand in this context, is that in the law, most of what we talk about in terms of transgender rights in this country have absolutely nothing to do with sex characteristics. So for the purposes of us here today in this episode, what we're talking about is gender identity and gender expression, and not sex characteristics. Because transgender people are people whose gender identity isn't in alignment with the one that was assigned to them at birth. I.e., who we are as people on the inside isn't in alignment with what the doctor, nurse, or midwife had said we are by a kind of evaluation of our external genitalia, if that makes sense. So hopefully that's a little bit of clarity around that. Now, transgender people in this country enjoy the same rights as everyone else. To make that absolutely clear, there is no differentiation in South African law between trans people and other people. So we are not afforded any kind of special rights in any kind of way. We are considered to be equal kind of people before the law, and we enjoy all of the same rights that everybody else does, and everybody else enjoys the kind of same rights that we do. So the law doesn't differentiate between transgender people and cisgender people. But there is a bit of legislation that kind of gets a little bit weird. Now, to talk about the kind of elephant in the room, the Department of Home Affairs is what we call the custodian of identity in the country. Effectively, they manage identity, they create the systems in order to kind of keep track of who is in the country, the kind of demographic information about that person, and that their databases are effectively up to date. Yeah. So in 2003, a bit of legislation was passed in South Africa called the Alteration of Sex Descriptor and Sex Status Act 49 of 2003. That's a mouthful, so we just call it Act 49. Act 49 is the guiding legislation that provides the framework for which transgender people are able to amend their gender markers in South Africa. Now, while it is amazing that South Africa has legal gender recognition laws for transgender people, the law is still a little bit problematic. And the clause that kind of governs this reads as follows. Any person whose sexual characteristics have been altered by surgical or medical treatment or by evolvement through natural development resulting in gender reassignment, or any person who is intersexed, may apply to the Director General of the National Department of Home Affairs for the alteration of the sex description on his or her birth register. Okay. Effectively, what this means is if you are transgender or you are intersex, you may apply to the Department of Home Affairs to have your birth register amended to reflect your appropriate sex description. Yeah. Can you see how those words are problematic? Now, for transgender people specifically, the legislation does go on to say the following. An application contemplated in subsection 1 must, which is the section that describes somebody who is transgender or intersexed, must be accompanied by the birth certificate of the applicant, and then in the case of a person whose sexual characteristics have been altered by surgical or medical treatment resulting in gender reassignment, must be accompanied by reports stating the nature and results of any procedure carried out and any treatment applied, prepared by the medical practitioners who carried out the procedures. So effectively what this means is that if you are transgender in South Africa and you want to amend your official documentation with the Department of Home Affairs to reflect your appropriate gender identity, you must firstly have had medical or surgical intervention to alter your sex characteristics, to bring that in alignment with your, gender. And then 2, the medical practitioners who administered that must write reports attesting to such change and such procedures or treatment. So the model that the Department of Home Affairs in South Africa works on currently for legal gender recognition is one that is medicalized. So in order to access the service, you effectively need to see a medical practitioner, not one, but 2 in terms of the legislation, who are able to write reports for you to attest that you have in fact, either been on hormonal therapy or you've gone through some kind of surgical intervention to alter your sex characteristics. Write that report, sign that document, then you make your application to the Department of Home Affairs. Yeah. So the fundamental problem with this model is that it is not based on any kind of human rights framework at all. For trans people trying to access this service, it is a direct infringement on their human dignity of who they are as people. Effectively, it means that your gender identity is only valid in terms of the eyes of the law, which is a protected ground in terms of the Constitution, is only valid in the eyes of the Department of Home Affairs in terms of Act 49 if you have had surgery or if you have had medical intervention, which is all kinds of wrong and problematic. But then also, to just access healthcare in South Africa is such a problem. We have a major problem with our state healthcare. It is so completely overburdened, and many of the state institutions are not equipped to be able to provide gender affirming care to trans clients. And so what that translates to is that if you are unable to afford kind of private healthcare, which is so extraordinarily expensive, your ability to amend your gender marker with the Department of Home Affairs, which should be such a simple process, is now being barred because you can't access gender affirming healthcare. So yeah, so while we have this wonderful legislation that goes, everybody's equal before the law and we should all enjoy the same rights, we have this bit of legislation that kind of allows us to amend our gender markers, allows us to amend our official documentation, is now suddenly sitting in a weird place because fundamentally Act 49 creates a conflict with the right to dignity, with the right to equality, to bodily autonomy as well. So what we have on paper is very different to what is in practice. We have discussed the kind of legal framework in which kind of governs South Africa and all its people, and we also got to speak a little bit about the specific legislation that kind of allows transgender people to amend their gender markers and what that kind of looks like. We're gonna focus in a little bit more on what the lived realities are of people on the ground, in spite of having all that kind of amazing things on paper. We talked about how the alteration of Sex Descriptor and Sex Status Act 49 of 2003, or just Act 49 for short, how this act is problematic. And although it gives transgender people the ability to amend their gender markers with the Department of Home Affairs, so that's your IDs, your passports, your birth certificates, all of those things can get amended, but that is determinant on your ability to access gender affirming healthcare in South Africa. And that in and of itself is a massive problem. Your ID documents in this country are so crucial. You can't go anywhere or do anything official without those documents. If you want to, open up a bank account, if you want to apply for a loan, if you want to register your child at school, if you want to go to university in any kind of way, anything that requires an official application form or any kind of official engagement in that way requires that identity document. And the thing that makes the ID document also a little bit tricky is because in South Africa, your gender marker is displayed on your smart ID card and is encoded in your actual ID number. Now, if you're a South African citizen, your ID number looks something like this. Now, this is a codified ID, which means the numbers in the ID represent something very, very specific. The first 6 digits of your ID is your date of birth. So anybody looking at your ID document can tell what year you were born in, what month, and what day. Yeah, so those are your first 6 digits of your ID. The following 4 numbers in your ID describe your gender marker. So effectively, if you are between 0001 and 4999, you are classified in this country as being female. If you are 5000 to 9999, you're classified as male. So somebody looking at your ID can tell whether you're male or female. Yeah, the next digit in the ID number speaks to whether or not you are a citizen of the country or not. So somebody looking at your ID can also tell whether you are a citizen or a foreign national. The digit after that used to be a race markers. Yes, so once upon a time there used to be racial kind of markers encoded in your ID number. If you still have the old green South African ID book, you can go in there and you can see there's like a little bit of a table with a racial classification of who was classified as what in the ID. And then the 13th digit in your ID is a kind of security check to make sure that the ID number is in fact valid. Now, the fact that we have this codified ID is already problematic in and of itself because we have privacy rights that are enshrined in the Constitution as well. And so effectively, if anybody looks at your ID, they can tell what your date of birth is, what your gender is, whether or not you are a citizen of this country. Historically, they could tell what your race was. So the ID number in and of itself, being a codified kind of ID, is problematic. Now, granted that the Department of Home Affairs is working on policy that does speak to the ID number, and where they are more in favor of a randomized ID number that's not kind of codified, which I'm also in favor of, but that is a separate video altogether. At the way things are right now, that codified ID number is for everyone. Everybody has the same kind of structure to the ID number. Now, if you're somebody like me who presents as very, very femme, with the exception of this very sexy masculine voice, which I like kind of very, very much, I digress. If you're somebody like me who presents as mostly feminine and you have an ID that says male, that presents a whole set of problems, particularly when it comes to other people. So if you're trying to access things like education, healthcare, those things suddenly become a problem. So for so many trans people in South Africa, accessing healthcare is so extraordinarily difficult. Part of that is because of the lack of training that healthcare workers have in dealing with trans people, just like on a human level, but then also on the kind of medical side of it. So there's just like this kind of lack of training and education around it, but also the stigma and discrimination that are perpetrated against trans people who are coming into like a clinic or to a hospital to receive services is profound. I mean, you can walk into a clinic or even like a private practice and be somebody like me and be faced with the most extraordinary discrimination for people to say, sorry, we don't treat people like you here, or we don't do that kind of thing here, or be met with this kind of invasive interrogation of who you are as a person when you're literally just there to like pick up pills. And the healthcare sector in South Africa doesn't really provide gender affirming care to trans people at all. As far as I'm aware, there are 2 state-run facilities around the country that provide gender affirming care to trans people. The one is Steve Biko in Gauteng and the other is Grooteskier here in Cape Town. Both of them are academic hospitals. Now, in order to access that healthcare service, you've got to jump through so many hoops. You've got to see a psychologist who then refers you to an endocrinologist who then does blood tests before they even put you on any kind of hormone. And that process can take like up to 6 months, maybe a year, if you're lucky. Like the state healthcare system is so incredibly overburdened, and layered on top of that, you're dealing with discrimination that is like coming at you from like all corners, which is a lot. Now, this is just for hormonal care. If you're wanting to access surgical care, I'm not sure what it is at Steve Biko, but at Grooteskier Hospital, the waiting list for surgery is 25 years. Let me say that again, 25 years. So healthcare in South Africa is a problem, and if you're transgender, it's even more of a mission unless you live in a major metropolitan city like Pretoria or Cape Town, or if you have shmoney, which most of us don't. So your ability to access healthcare is directly linked and tied to your ability to amend your gender marker with the Department of Home Affairs, right? Because they require that you produce 2 letters from doctors who attest that you have in fact undergone medical or gender reassignment before you can be eligible to be considered for an application. And so what that also means is that your ability to access healthcare is linked to your ability to amend your gender marker at the Department of Home Affairs, which is linked to your ability to find employment, to access education, to access shelter, because the levels of discrimination in South Africa is a really kind of actually a conservative, very, very conservative country. And so transgender people like are met with like barriers at literally every single entry point. So you are denied access to education because you don't look like what your ID document says you do. Like people think you are being fraudulent in some kind of way. I mean, these are not like minor inconveniences. These little acts are the things that lead up to extreme violence being perpetrated against trans people in South Africa. Like something as small as like, you know, being stopped by the cops at like a roadblock. If they look at your ID and you're like, oh no, like your ID doesn't look like who you are, like you should see my ID, lol. Like if it doesn't look like who you are, like they like think that you're like committing fraud. And fingers crossed that I never get arrested, but if I were to go to jail as is with my ID documents reflecting as they do, I would be put in a male cell. Now can you imagine me in a cell with other men? Like that's incredibly scary for someone like me. But to also put things in perspective, it's these little aggressions that manifest themselves in the extreme kind of violence that we experience. Like, we are at risk for like murder, like in this country, like it's nobody's business. Like, it is terrifying to just walk anywhere, like as like a kind of cisgender person in this country. Like, that's already like sometimes very difficult, but as a trans person to be out in public is already putting yourself at risk. And I'm not exaggerating this in any kind of way. We've seen over a number of years the level of violence and the murder levels that have kind of swept our community, the LGBT community, specifically trans people. And it's not just like, murder that's like, somebody just got like, stabbed because they were being robbed or whatever. Like, it's gratuitous, it is extreme, it's horrifying, like the type of violence that is being, the way that we are being killed. I mean, you'll see me up and down on this channel and like, doing vlogs and being in public spaces and being like amazing. But I'm very careful about the spaces that I choose to go to, because I know that there are some places that I definitely cannot and will not ever go into, because like I'm genuinely fearing for my life here. And I have like an extraordinary level of privilege. Like, I can kind of afford private healthcare to a particular degree. I have a very good, solid education. I am employed. I'm middle class. There is a kind of privilege that I do carry, and I'm experiencing this level. Now, that in perspective, what is it like? And this is the question that I always ask people when we talk about perspective. What does that mean for somebody in this country who doesn't have education, who can't access private healthcare, who isn't employed? So what does it look like for the poor black trans lesbian living in a rural setting? And in this country, as far as implementation goes, it's usually that person that everybody thinks about last. That said, there are lots of moves that are being made by civil society, a lot of NGOs who are working together very, very closely with government to amend a lot of these laws and the legislation to try and fix effectively this system to make it work for trans people, specifically looking at Act 49, looking at what does it look like to have a bit of legislation that is focused on human rights, that is using human rights as a framework where people are able to, self-determine their gender. So you'd be able to walk into a Department of Home Affairs and be like, I need to change my gender marker. Here's my application and this is why, and have that be done. I mean, there are a number of countries, including Iceland, Malta, Argentina, who have these human rights frameworks for their legal gender recognition laws, and it works amazingly. So there are moves being made with the Department of Home Affairs, with the Department of Health, with a number of government stakeholders, so that we can kind of, I guess, give more life to that constitution, give more life to that notion of non-discrimination, on the notion of equality, that we can all enjoy the same rights, that we can live lives that are full and dignified. I hope this was helpful. If you have been enjoying this content and if it's bringing you some kind of value, please hit that subscribe button and turn the bell on for notifications to stay in the loop for upcoming videos. And I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.